Welcome to Movie Stories. Today's story is based on real-life events. It was filmed as a drama, biography and history film in 2019, titled Dark Waters. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. One night in 1975, a car drives down a street in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Two men and a woman get out of the car and enter private property to swim in the lake. While two of them are swimming and inviting their friend, who is sitting inland, a boat approaches. They scare the group away and spray the lake with an unknown substance. The year is 1998 in Cincinnati, Ohio. During a meeting, Robert Belote is announced by Tom as a partner at Taft, the law firm he works at. Meanwhile, two men come looking for Robert. He is pulled out of the meeting by his paralegal. Wilbur Tennant claims to be a neighbor of his grandmother's and says that the water in their town has been poisoned and hands Robert a box of tapes that could prove his claims. Robert says that he can't do anything because he's a defense lawyer for chemical companies. Tom asks him to return to the meeting and Robert wishes Wilbur luck and goes back. After leaving the office with his colleagues, Robert stops at a phone booth to call his grandmother, but she doesn't answer. He gets home and has dinner with his wife Sarah and his child. Robert seems distracted. The next day, Robert drives to his grandmother in Parkersburg. He sees a kid with really black teeth, but doesn't think much of it. His grandmother is pleasantly surprised about his visit. She explains that the man's farm is where Robert sometimes played as a kid and shows him photos. He then visits Wilbur's house. The farmer voices his frustrations about the institutions that are supposed to help in these situations ignoring his phone calls. He shows Robert parts of his dead cows, massive gall, teeth black as night, a tumor. He then leads Robert to a creek with white stones, supposedly bleached by the chemicals. His animals drink this water. They have become aggressive. When Robert sees two cows, he asks where the rest are and Wilbur shows him a field where 190 of his cows are buried. The farmer mentions that his brother used to dig up ditches at DuPont but got sick and couldn't work anymore. DuPont then offered to buy his land and promised no chemicals. After that, all the problems started. Wilbur filed complaints with everyone he could think of multiple times. Finally, the Environmental Protection Agency came to do an investigation but didn't even show him the results. At a Taft law firm event, Phil Donnelly, the lawyer for DuPont, is invited to speak. He gives a speech on how DuPont produces chemicals to make people's lives easier, happier and longer. Better living through chemistry is not only their slogan, but their DNA. Afterwards, Robert approaches him and inquires if he knows anything about Wilbur's farm. Phil recalls sending some people to check it out, and Robert asks for the report to share it with Wilbur to settle his nerves. Robert hands Wilbur the report he got from Phil, which states that the herd on his farm was deficient due to poor care. This infuriates Wilbur, who has been farming for his whole life, and he confronts the lawyer about his willingness to accept everything the report says. Suddenly, a cow shows up and Wilbur has to put it down for its erratic behavior. Disturbed by what is happening, Robert drives around town observing the amount of DuPont factories in the region, as well as the people on the street. After reviewing Wilbur's gruesome tapes, he shows them to Tom. Robert suggests filing a claim to trigger discovery so that he can figure out what's in the landfill near the farm, because there is obviously something very wrong. Tom reluctantly agrees and asks his colleague to be discreet. Robert then phones Phil, who promises to give him information about the case. A year later, Robert analyzes new evidence in Tennant's case. He finds multiple mentions of a substance called PFOA, but he can't find any information about it anywhere. In his office, Robert is discussing the case with one of his colleagues, Kim Burke. Robert questions why they use drums when they supposedly don't have any hazardous liquid waste. They talk about how even though the EPA is responsible for regulating chemicals, companies always know more about the substances they use. Robert wonders if the reason Phil agreed so easily to send him discovery documents on hazardous substances is because whatever they use isn't regulated and therefore considered hazardous. After his calls to Phil are ignored, Robert attends the Ohio Chemical Alliance dinner to confront him. Sarah befriends her husband's colleagues while he searches for Phil. When he is finally able to confront the DuPont attorney, he says that they need to expand the investigation to include everything in the landfill, whether it is hazardous or not, because the substance causing the problem is not regulated by the EPA. Phil gets angry and threatens Robert's career. The argument ends with Phil calling Robert names. Sarah argues with Robert about his behavior at dinner. The next day Tom does the same. But Robert says he's going to sue DuPont. He calls Larry, who acts as his local attorney, and they initiate the process to sue the company. DuPont sends Robert hundreds of boxes and he gets to work. Wilbur and his friend enter a diner and realize people are treating them differently because they are suing the biggest employer in the city. Robert finds more references to PFOA. He meets with a chemist, Dr. Gillespie, to figure out what it is. He hasn't heard of it but mentions a similar sounding one, PFOS. It is a man-made substance consisting of a long chain of carbon atoms with a fluoride atom. Robert figures out what the C8 stands for. A chain like that is pretty much unbreakable. Robert inquires what would happen if someone drank it, but Gillespie says that he doesn't know. Another year later, the tenants attend the church and observe uncomfortable looks. At home, Robert is lost in thought while his son is playing. He remembers seeing a girl at Parkersburg with dark teeth and recalls the substance he encountered has fluoride in it. When he calls Dr. Gillespie and asks him what drinking the substance would do to people's teeth, the doctor says that even though in trace amounts fluoride is good for teeth, too much of it could stain them and even turn them black. Documents from the boxes confirm that the substance has been found in Parkersburg's water supply. Wilbur and his wife go to the doctor to treat a cough that has been plaguing him for months. The doctor notices there are marks on his arms. They arrive home and realize that someone has been there. Wilbur hides the tapes. Helicopter appears above the farm and Wilbur screams at the pilot to go away. Meanwhile, Robert is still lost in the sauce. He comes across a picture of a pan. That night his wife is woken up by him going through their cookware. Robert says they're being poisoned and she thinks he has lost it. Distressed at his behavior, she starts arguing with him, but he convinces her to listen to his findings. PFOA or C8 was a substance initially used to make waterproof coating for tanks. It was later renamed to Teflon and applied to pans for its non-stick capabilities. When factory workers who made Teflon started becoming sick, DuPont ran some studies and realized that it was highly toxic to humans. They knew this since 1962, but chose to cover up the evidence and continued making products containing C8. They released the manufacturing byproducts into the air and rivers, but the sludge drums started washing up, so DuPont had to start digging ditches to bury them. One of the diggers was Wilbur's brother Jim. DuPont also tested the substance on rats. They were getting tumors in their organs ballooned. Pregnant rats gave birth to deformed pups. After this they removed all the young women off the Teflon line without telling them why. One of them gave birth to a kid with face deformities, so she went to them and asked if the C8 she was exposed to caused them. Her records working with Teflon then disappeared and a year later they put all the women back on Teflon and never said a thing. They knew that the C8 they buried in the ground was leaking and causing sickness and that their workers were getting sick too. Their consumers were being exposed to C8 not just in non-stick pans, but also paints, fabrics, raincoats, boots and other stuff. Robert confronts Phil, who knew that C8 was poison for 40 years. It stays in humans forever because their bodies are unable to break it down. Still he did nothing, because DuPont was making $1 billion in profit a year, just from Teflon. Later he tells all this to Wilbur, who asks Robert to put these people behind bars, but the lawyer says it will be too difficult to do so and the best they can hope for is money for the damages. Wilbur doesn't want money, but justice. He and his wife are already irreversibly sick. Robert arrives home devastated and his wife consoles him. She convinces him exposing DuPont is a matter of public safety, so he decides to go for it. He sends their internal documents to the government. DuPont petitioned the judge to stop Robert from testifying, but the judge rejected it. Robert tries to convince his firm to start a class action lawsuit against DuPont. Even though C8 isn't regulated, they would only have to prove that the contamination level in Parkersburg's water exceeded what DuPont scientists considered safe. DuPont had been secretly testing the water for years and the C8 levels were 6 times higher than that. The lawyers aren't very open to the idea. Tom steps in and says that if they actually read the documents Robert has provided, exposing DuPont's corruption and willful negligence, they would all want to hold him accountable. In 2002 Robert encounters Wilbur at court, who is very debilitated. At the courtroom, DuPont's lawyer Edward Wallace carries his motion. He reveals a commission has been formed to regulate the level of PFOA or C8 in West Virginia, and according to their independent scientist, the water in Parkersburg wells falls way below the maximum allowed level, which is now apparently 150 times higher than DuPont's own scientists initially said it to. The attorneys accusing DuPont, including Harry Dietzler, who leads the accusations, are revolted, and the masses protest outside. In Wilmington, Delaware, Robert leads a deposition of Charles Holliday, the chairman and executive officer for DuPont. Over the next 7 hours Robert shows him a bunch of DuPont's documents and studies, proving that the company knew about all the harm caused by C8. The EPA concluded that DuPont failed to report the dangers of C8 used in manufacturing of Teflon and fined them only $16.5 million, which is nothing compared to the profits they make. The lawyers and other parties involved attend a meeting. It is revealed that DuPont will also pay $70 million to the masses, Install water filtration systems in the city and pay up to $235 million in medical monitoring if an independent council of experts proves the residents were harmed by C8 exposure. However, if nothing is proven, the medical monitoring and lawsuits by residents won't happen. At a bar, the lawyers discuss the challenges of proving the population's exposure to C8. Harry feels that the residents of Parkersburg will prefer to just take the money, but Robert says they will want to know if they are in any danger. He suggests paying the residents for giving their blood sample. It's 2005 and Robert heads to the blood sampling station, where people are waiting in lines to give their blood and get $400 each. Christmas arrives at Billet's house and Robert receives a call that informs him that 69,000 people have been tested. 2009. Wilbur Tennant has passed away and Robert attends his funeral. After the ceremony, the Billets go to a diner where a man approaches them and says accusingly that his brother died. Even though they got his blood sample, the help didn't come in time. People are agitated because they sued DuPont 4 years ago, but haven't seen any results from it. The lawyer inquires about the study, but due to the huge amount of data, it is still being processed. Another year has passed and the Billets are having breakfast. Robert seems dissatisfied and when the boys leave, Sarah starts arguing with him. She points out all the family problems he forgot or didn't know about because he is obsessed with the case. He doesn't reply. Another year later, Robert receives his fourth pay cut by his boss Tom, who has been financing the huge study all these years. DuPont has a hold on the government and they are trying to make the case as expensive as possible, so the firm drops it. They get into an argument and Robert starts shaking until he collapses on the floor. At the hospital, Sarah and Tom learn that Robert has experienced a transient ischemic attack, so he needs to take medication and eliminate sources of stress in his life. Tom tells Sarah that if she needs anything she can ask. She confronts him about making Robert feel like a failure. Sarah goes to her husband's room and starts crying. It is 2012. The Billets attend church and then go to a gas station and Robert ends up meeting Bucky, one of the children born with deformities in the 70s due to his mother's C8 exposure. At his office, Robert receives a call from the science panel. The largest epidemiological study in human history is finally done after 7 years. They have linked exposure of C8 to 6 serious categories of illness. 3,535 people from the study are already sick and many more will develop diseases, but thanks to the study they will all be monitored and receive medical help if they get sick. Robert drives home and tells the news to his wife. The family has dinner at a restaurant to celebrate, but Robert receives a call from Larry and heads out. Sarah goes after him and asks what happened. DuPont have gone back on their earlier promise of medical monitoring and is dismissing the study. They plan to fight every individual claim in court. The sick people can't fight such a massive company and Robert thinks they will give up. Robert voices his disappointment in the system, realizing that it's rigged. In 2015, the 3,535 cases went to court. Robert won the first 3 cases, for millions each. DuPont settled the rest for $670.7 million, not even a year's profit. Many movements to fight unregulated chemicals arose after this case. 99% of humans are believed to have PFOA in their blood. Teflon was replaced by new unregulated chemicals called Gen X and PFBS, but they seem to be just as toxic, so you might want to reconsider your pan choices. Robert Billet keeps fighting to this day. And that's how this story ends. Please subscribe for more stories like this one.